Welcome back to the MMA Training Bible's Guide to Peak Performance. And so just to recap, in the first session we talked about the big picture. We introduced you to the blueprint for building peak performance, how we go about developing an individualized and periodized training plan just for you. In the second session, we planned the big training phases across your whole fight plan. This session we're going to drill deeper. We're going to build on those individual phases. We're going to forecast training volume and intensity across all those phases. And after that, we're going to drill deeper still. We're going to start planning training subphases in weeks in session 4 and in session 5. We're going to really go into a lot of detail. We're going to tell you exactly how to plan and program your training sessions across your whole fight plan. So welcome to session 3, forecasting training volume and intensity. And so in this session, we'll aim to forecast training volume and intensity across the transition and the taper and the fight camp and the fight-specific preparatory phase, and obviously the longer plans will have the general prep phase, while the shorter plans won't. Okay, so here is what we're going to cover in this session. First, we'll review where we're at with our fight plan. After this, we'll forecast training volume and intensity across the transition, followed by the taper. We'll organize the fight camp, and we'll lay out the fight-specific prep phase for the longer plans. We'll slot in the general prep phase, but again, we don't need to worry about that in the shorter plans. So let's start by reviewing everything we've done so far. So the first thing we did, we scheduled the transition, which was around 3 to 6 weeks after your fight. It's longer and longer plans, and it's shorter and shorter plans. Next, we scheduled the taper, which always takes up 2 weeks before your fight. Then we scheduled your fight camp, which always takes up 8 weeks before your taper. In the longer plans, the next thing we scheduled was the general preparatory phase, which would take up at least half of the remaining time. And this phase, it doesn't take place in the shorter plans because the shorter plans, again, assume that fighters are more advanced and has a solid base of fitness. And the last scheduled phase, in this case, was the fight-specific preparatory phase. Okay, so let's have a look at step 2, forecasting training volume and intensity across the fight plan. So in this figure, you're going to see 2 lines. The red one represents training intensity, and the blue one represents training volume. In the longer plans, where there is a general preparatory phase, intensity starts low and builds slowly across the plan. Training volume starts low as well, but it builds higher and higher such that by the end of this phase, it's at about 100%. Now, in the longer fight plans, the specific phase training volume decreases gradually and training intensity increases gradually, crossing over at about the midway point in this phase. The shorter plans, training volume and intensity, they're going to rise much more quickly, but training volume drops towards the end of this phase. Even well-trained athletes cannot tolerate high training volumes and intensities for very long. Now, training intensity, it continues to build through the fight camp while training volume continues to drop. And what you'll notice here is a little bump in training volume at the beginning of the fight camp. This is designed to bring about a positive adaptation that presents itself before your fight. Now, when we get to the taper, you're going to notice that training volume drops drastically. And this encourages a lot of the fatigue from previous training to dissipate before your fight, and hopefully this will bring about a peak in your fight performance. Some people call this process peaking an athlete. And there's nothing mystical about it, and I'll teach you how to do it. Now, after your fight, both training volume and intensity drastically drop and build slowly as you transition into your next fight plan. That's why they call it a transition. Now what I want to do is apply this to your fight plan template. So let's go ahead and bring up the fight plan template, and we'll get going here. Okay, so here's our 12-month plan. Now I've gone ahead and I've created the lines in Excel, which can be a little bit tricky if you're not really used to working in Excel. And again, that's why I suggest you work with pencil and paper if you're not an Excel wizard. In any case, you can see here the training volume, it's shown in blue, and training intensity, it's shown in red. Now, we're going to deal with one phase at a time as we go through this, and we're going to start with the general preparatory phase and with training volume. Now, to make this easy, you want to start by just simply putting a blue dot by the 50% number at the beginning of your fight plan. This is about where your training volume should start. Then place another blue dot around the 80% mark about halfway through the general preparatory phase. Then another blue dot at the 100% mark at somewhere around 1 month left in the general preparatory phase. And after this, just simply connect the dots with a blue line that represents training volume across your general preparatory phase. Okay, so let's have a look at training intensity now. So training intensity, you'll notice it starts out lower in the general prep phase, somewhere around 25%, somewhere around at that mark. So what you should do is you should make a red dot right around there at that 25% mark. You should be around 50% training intensity about halfway through this phase, so make another red dot there. And by the end of the general preparatory phase, you should be somewhere around 75% for training intensity, so go ahead and make another red dot around there. Now again, simply connect the red dots with the red line, and what you've got now is your training intensity scheduled across your general preparatory phase. Okay, let's move over to the fight specific phase. So for the fight specific phase, you should place a blue dot around the 70% mark at the end of the phase, and then connect the last two blue dots together. And similarly, you should place a red dot around the 95% mark at the end of this phase, then again, connect the last two dots together. And so what you'll notice is that there's this inverse relationship between training volume and training intensity, and they cross over at about the halfway mark of this phase. Okay, so this brings us to the fight camp. Let's slide over, and we'll go right to the end here. Okay, so for the fight camp, place a blue dot around the 90% mark at the end of the second week in the fight camp, then place another blue dot around the 60% mark at the end of the fight camp, and then simply connect the blue dots. Now, you want to make sure that you have a defining bump in training volume at the beginning of the fight camp, and the slow reduction in training volume that takes place thereafter. That's the important thing to get. Okay, for training intensity, place a red dot around the 100% mark at the end of the fight camp, then connect the red dots with a red line. Now, you may be wondering why we have an increase in training volume in the second and third weeks of the fight camp, especially because I said you should avoid training with both high levels of intensity and high levels of volume, as it can lead to overtraining. And this is certainly true, but short periods with a high training load can promote performance adaptations, and that's a pretty important thing. But the important thing to note is that these physiological adaptations, they take somewhere in the region of at least 6 weeks to present. That's why we schedule this bump about 8 weeks out from your fight to bring about a positive adaptation that will present itself for the fight. This also points to why we reduce training volume between this point and the fight. I mean, simply put, the training that you do in the few weeks before your fight won't bring about an adaptation until after your fight, so the emphasis starts switching from building performance factors to dissipating fatigue and maintaining your performance for the fight. So after the fight camp comes the taper. So place another blue dot around the 35% mark after the first taper week, and another blue dot around the 20% mark after the second taper week, then simply connect the dots. Now, training intensity should be maintained at about 100% throughout the taper. So draw the lines as shown here. And again, the purpose of this is to maintain performance by working out at a very high intensity and dissipating fatigue by drastically lowering your training volume, which again should bring about a peak in your performance for the fight. Okay, for your transition, training volume, ultimately, it gradually increases to around 40% by its end, while training intensity should be somewhere around 10% and gradually increase to around 30% by the end of the transition. This roughly equates to where you start at the fight plan, if you recall, and this is appropriate and it represents your transition into your next fight plan. Okay, so let's go ahead and scroll back to the beginning of this fight plan here. Okay, so this is what your training volume and intensity should be looking like across your whole fight plan. Here's the fight specific phase again, and then here's the fight camp, the taper, and the transition. Okay, so let's go back over to the slideshow. Okay, so our fight plan is really starting to come together. We've scheduled the big training phases first, and now we understand how training volume and training intensity should change across your fight plan, all ultimately to the end of bringing about a peak in your performance for your fight. Okay, so let's leave it here for now. Next time, we'll further dig into our training plan by focusing on sub-phases and training weeks. Until then, take care.